Well, welcome. My name is Joel. I'm a pastor on staff here. If we've never met, now you've met me, but I still haven't met you. So I'd love to meet you later. But I have the great joy of continuing on in our series. We've been going, now this is our fourth week in Standing Strong, Risk Takers, I can say that, Risk Takers of the Bible. We've talked about Abraham, we talked about Joseph. Last week, if you were here, we talked about Hannah. And her risk. And today, we're going to, if you remember last week, Hannah had prayed and prayed for a son. She went through a lot of pain and difficulty in her life and hoping for a son. And eventually Samuel came. So she named him Samuel, God hears. So today, we're going to look at the life of Samuel. Samuel is the risk taker. That's what I meant to say, next risk taker, but risk taker. Why can't I say risk taker? Risk taker. Okay. I'll try to get there. Anyway, if you were here last week, you know, it was heavy. We're talking a lot about Hannah and dealing with pain and difficulty. This week will be a little lighter, if that's okay. You guys all right with that? Okay, good. Today, what we're going to talk about mostly is what kept Samuel strong in difficult circumstances. When enemies were coming, when he had to address all of Israel and rebuke all these people all at the same time, what kept him strong was Samuel had an incredibly clear view of who God is. And so he was able to depend on that and know that he was doing the right thing by God. How we view people, how you view someone really does impact a lot of how you treat them, of how you treat others. I was with my family at the LA Zoo. This was 2 years ago. We're at the LA Zoo, and me and my wife and my 4 kids, and we're having a blast. And all of a sudden, the 6 of us are standing there, and my oldest son, he was 11 at the time, he's there, and then he says, "Giraffe!" And he starts running. And we're just like, what happened? Like, down a hill, around a corner, you can see a giraffe head. And so he just saw a giraffe and was going to go see the giraffe. So while he's sprinting off, then my younger son, who at the time was 5, I can remember, he takes off after him. So I have 2 other little kids there that were like, oh, and their ages are, at the time, were something else, the other ages. 6 and 4, thank you. My wife's over here to help me out, 6 and 4. My daughters, we're with our daughters, and we're like, oh man. And as soon as our little guy, our little 5-year-old, is running around, there's like a wall that goes around this corner. And while he's about to go down, these 2 huge golf carts are coming up. And they're not like golf carts that you would ever take on a golf course. They're like people-moving golf carts. And so the first one comes around. The second one is pretty close to the wall, and my son is close to the wall. So, I mean, we pick up the pace, we're trying to get there, and all of a sudden there's somebody sitting in the back seat of the second cart, but he's facing backwards. And he takes his arm, reaches out, and just puts his hand on my son Evan's chest to just be like, you're going to be okay. I'm not going to let this thing kill you, right? If something happens, I can pick you up. And it was a big arm. But he was looking out for my kid. So my wife got up there first, and she's like, about to turn around and say, "Thank you, sir, for saving the life of my child." And I get up there, and she looks like a little strange. You know, she's like, "Thank you." She looks a little strange. I get up there and go around the golf cart, and I'm like, "Hey, it's Shaquille O'Neal." And so I'm like, "Hey, thank." And then I realize while they're driving away, I'm wearing a Lakers shirt right at that moment. You guys that don't see me during the week, I wear a Lakers shirt pretty much all week, you know, so it's not like a big surprise, but he's driving away and I'm like, you know, and he's just laughing at me and he drives away. So about an hour later, we're down getting some snacks. My kids reminded me of this when we were talking about this story recently. I'm the cheapest dad in America. And so instead of like buying everybody a Slurpee, I bought a couple big Slurpees, asked for some water cups, right? And so we're like distributing our Slurpees into these like little water cup-sized Slurpees, right? Yeah. Who needs to give their 5-year-old this much sugar? I don't, right? Come on. Thank you. can you guys talk to my children later and just let them know I'm not crazy? Anyway, it really has nothing to do with the sugar. It was all cost related. I didn't want to spend the money for everybody to have their own Slurpee. Anyway, we're sitting there, we're having our mini Slurpees, and the golf carts come back down to where we are. And so we're sitting there, and Shaq is still in the back of this golf cart, and it looks like his family or somebody, there's some people with him. They're there to have a good time, not for me to become best friends with Shaq, right? That's not the purpose of him being there. But as soon as they stop, this woman runs up to Shaq before he can even get out. She pushes herself against him and is taking a selfie. She said nothing to him. She wasn't like, oh, I'm a big fan, can I take a picture? She's just like, and I'm like, man. She treated him like he was a wax museum character, right? Like, oh, go take pictures with Wax Shaq, And I'm just sitting there like, man, we really objectify these people in our culture. We just turn them into these objects that are there for us. I at least had enough respect and dignity to stand far away and take this picture, right? Oops. It was up there. You guys saw it. Oh, there you go. All right. And he's wearing his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle shirt, so that was exciting. So I'm taking this awkward picture, but you can see where he's facing, right? So Shaq remembers me because he wants to be my friend as much as I want to be his. So he walks over, and he walks up to my little son, Evan, whose life he saved, and Evan's little Slurpee, and he says, hey, man, can I have some of your Slurpee? To which Evan is like, The point is this. The way that we view someone, and at the time also, so I'm there, and now this is my chance, right? He's there, and so I'm thinking of all these things to both communicate, hey, I'm a big fan, and also, I'm not starstruck, we can just hang, it's fine. You're here with your family, I don't want to bug you, I just wanted you to be my best friend, So all these thoughts are going. I also had this thought I wanted to somehow say, and there are not uncreepy words to say this. I wanted to say, I could tell you the exact spot at Capo Valley High School I was standing when somebody told me that you were coming to the Lakers. I remember. We could walk over there right now. I could show you where my feet were when somebody said Shaq is going to be a Laker, and I would be like, oh, but how would I tell him that, right, without being a little bit of a weirdo? So how you view someone has a massive impact on your behavior. For this woman who just thought he was like a pop culture object, she's going to take a picture like you would with, the Liberty Bell or something. For my son, Shaq is tall. He's really tall. He's a very tall man who's trying to steal his Slurpee, right? So for Evan, his behavior is ungenerous. He only got this much Slurpee. He's going to protect it. If you're my wife, right, you view Shaq as somebody that is looking out for your kids, is a genuinely nice guy. And some other people might view him as somebody who really was instrumental in turning around the world's greatest sports franchise, and bringing 3 straight NBA championships back to Los Angeles after a drought in the 90s. Somebody could see him that way, and it impacts your behavior, how you view somebody. The same is true when we talk not just about people, but when we talk about God. The way that we view God, what we believe to be true about God, impacts everything. It impacts every decision. These 2 professors at Baylor University, they wrote this book where they reveal 4 views of people, 4 views of God people have. So they interviewed a bunch of people, and they tried to categorize, and also, the 5th one that they didn't write about is people that don't believe that God exists. But even that view of God impacts your behavior, right? But these other 4, for people who believe in God, they said people believe in either an authoritarian God, a benevolent God, a critical God, or the distant God. Those are kind of the 4 categories. And depending on what you see as God's primary being, if you think that God is an authoritarian, you're going to be, very get in line and do your thing and guilt-driven and just do good. If you believe that God is distant, right, you're going to be the opposite. It's just not really, it's up to you. It's not really that important. He's not watching. A.W. Tozer phrased it this way. I thought it was great. he always asks me if what he writes is great or not, and I thought this one was great. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What do we believe to be true about God? Who is he? How does he operate? It's incredibly important. Samuel had a very proper, true view of who God was, and this is really the most important thing I'm going to say today. Because he had a great view of who God was, because he was very near and close to God. So he got his information about who God was and how he operated by spending time with God, by being near and close. After being given over for God's work, his mother, we talked about it last week, his mother promised that she would leave him at the tabernacle to do God's work for the rest of his life. After he was left there, his father figure when he was there was this guy named Eli, who was a priest and judge over Israel. And so it was Eli, and Eli already had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, everybody's favorite names. And so these guys kind of were the ones that helped raise Samuel in the ways of the Lord. So they were the priests. And so he was there, but so you would think in a situation like that where he's with these godly guys that it'd be really easy for him to develop a perfect view of who God is. But as we'll see, that it really wasn't the case. And in order for Samuel to be able to stand strong, as we're going to look at in a battle and in many times, he had to stay close to God to find out who God was. As our story moved along, the specific story we're going to look at today is in 1 Samuel chapter 7. What had happened, we're now after the death of Eli, after the death of Eli's sons, and Samuel is really now the prophet and kind of the spiritual leader of Israel. And previously, there was a battle with Israel and the Philistines, and the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant. If you're not familiar with the Ark of the Covenant, there's a documentary about it. Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. You can learn a little bit about it there. But the Ark of the Covenant was this incredibly important thing in the life of Israel. It held the Ten Commandments and Aaron's staff and lots of other things. And God had said that it was important. Eventually, once the temple is built, it takes a very important place there. It's super duper important. And it got taken away in battle. So now the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant. And Israel, for 7 months, doesn't have it. And they just feel like, man, what are we going to do? We don't have the presence of God with us. Eventually, I'm not going to tell you all the details. You can read them on your own. It's a very funny story. But in chapters 5 and 6, it kind of details what happens with the ark. But eventually, it comes back to Israel. Okay, so that's where we are in the story. They just got the Ark of the Covenant back. In chapter 7, verse 2. You ready? The ark remained in Kiriath Jearim for a long time, 20 years in all. During that time, during these 20 years where the ark is now back in Israel, all Israel mourned because it seemed the Lord had abandoned them. It's strange. They got the ark back and they felt abandoned. Then Samuel said to all the people of Israel, "If you want to return to the Lord with all your hearts, get rid of your foreign gods and your images of Ashtoreth. Turn your hearts to the Lord and obey him alone. Then he will rescue you from the Philistines." So the Israelites got rid of their images of Baal and Ashtoreth and worshipped only the Lord. The reason he says rescue you from the Philistines had defeated the Israelites, and they really continued to have some enslavement of the Israelites and control over them. That's why they also felt like God had abandoned them. Verse 7, when the Philistine rulers heard that Israel had gathered at Mizpah. I just skipped 2 verses. Okay, verse 5. Let's go to verse 5. Then Samuel told them, "Gather all of Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you." So they gathered at Mizpah, and in a great ceremony drew water from a well, poured it out before the Lord. Then this is what they did. They also went without food all day. They fasted and confessed that they had sinned against the Lord. It was at Mizpah that Samuel became Israel's judge. When the Philistine rulers heard that Israel had gathered at Mizpah, they mobilized their army and advanced. The Israelites were badly frightened when they learned that the Philistines were approaching. Don't stop pleading with the Lord our God to save us from the Philistines, they begged Samuel. So Samuel took a young lamb and offered it to the Lord as a whole burnt offering. He pleaded with the Lord to help Israel, and the Lord answered him. Just as Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines arrived to attack Israel. But the Lord spoke with a mighty voice of thunder from heaven that day. Likely means he sent a crazy, crazy thunderstorm. The men of Israel, and the Philistines were thrown into such confusion that the Israelites defeated them. The men of Israel chased them from Mizpah to a place below Bethkar, slaughtering them all the way. In this story, Samuel is the leader, essentially, of Israel, and the Philistines are coming. They're on their way to attack, but he was able to stand strong. He was able to stand strong, and Israel was preserved, and the Philistines were defeated. Samuel's view of God is what enabled him, as we've said, to stand strong in this whole situation. But before we look specifically at Samuel's view of God, I want to see what some other views of God were at the time, so that we can see it wasn't just easy. Samuel's views on who God was were not prevalent. He really had to work hard to stay close to God, to understand God during this time. The first thing we're going to look at is Samuel's culture's view of God. Samuel lived in the land of Israel, right? So you'd think these are God's people. Of course, they must have a great view of who God is and how he operates. But at that time, they didn't. They really, I would describe their view of God as that God is a lucky charm. He lives in a box. If we have the box, we receive victory and prosperity. That was their view. The box is the Ark of the Covenant. And they really felt like everything hinged on that box. It's kind of funny when people say, don't put me in a box or don't put God in a box. That's usually figurative. They literally thought God was in a box, right? And if they had the box, they had God. And if they didn't have the box, they were going to lose. If we look at an earlier battle in chapter 4, we can kind of get a sense of what they believed to be true about God, their view of God. The Philistines, this is 1 Samuel 4:2. The Philistines attacked and defeated the army of Israel, killing 4,000 men. After the battle was over, the troops retreated to their camp, and the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord allow us to be defeated by the Philistines?" Right? It's a good question to ask. They went to battle and they lost. Then they said, so they didn't wait for an answer. They're not trying to figure out why. What is it that enabled us to be defeated? They just came up with a plan. They said, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh. If we carry it into battle, the Ark, will save us from our enemies. Not, let's seek the Lord. Let's ask God if there's something communally that we need to be confessing our sin of. Let's see what God wants us to do. They're like, oh, we know what you do. You grab the box and you take it and you win. So they carried it into battle, and that's the battle where it got taken from them. And not only did the ark get taken from them, but Eli's 2 sons died in that battle. And not only that, a messenger came back to tell Eli those 3 things had happened. The ark was gone, and his sons had died. Eli fell backwards and broke his neck and died right then as well. The people believed the glory of God, the power of God, left with the ark. It stayed with the Philistines for about 7 months. And as we're trying to understand the Israelites' culture, their cultural view of God, let's also look back at something we already read. We already read in chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, these things. We'll jump forward in verse 2. It says, during that time, I want to focus on this phrase, all Israel mourned because it seemed the Lord had abandoned them, right? Keep that in your head. In Israel's view, God had abandoned them. Then Samuel starts talking in verse 3, and look what Samuel says. If you want to return to the Lord with all your hearts, get rid of your foreign gods and your images of Ashtoreth. And you're like, they thought God abandoned them while they were worshiping, but they were worshiping other gods, right? And in this all-important box of God that they had, if they would have opened it, which they shouldn't do, right? We know from the movie, they shouldn't open the box. But they would see in the 10 Commandments that right away, God is like, worship me only. Make no graven images. And then they're confused, like, Why has God abandoned us just because we have these graven images and we're worshiping other gods? They had this view of God that they could manipulate him, that if they did the right stuff, if they had the right stuff, that God would bless them no matter what else they were doing. They could be as rebellious as they wanted as long as they had the God box. Imagine. It could be hard for us to imagine, but imagine a culture where people believed that as long as they had the right God stuff and they did some God-related stuff, they could do whatever they wanted with the rest of their lives, and God was obligated to bless them, even if what they did was directly opposed to God's desires for their life. I can imagine it. I've lived that, where I'm like, man, God, you take this part and, like I did my God stuff, right? The God stuff is good. But that's not how God wants to be worshiped. God wants us to submit everything to him. But I think it's worth taking just a couple moments and thinking about, there was this cultural influence that existed in Israel that Samuel had to fight against. He had to work against. Their view of God was, if we have the box, we win. If we don't have the box, we lose. And Samuel had to step in when they had that view. After 20 years, they weren't being blessed. And Samuel's like, guys, come on. Turn to God. Right? He knew he had a proper view of who God was. So the question comes to me, what does my culture, and I'm not just talking about secular culture, what does American culture, both in the church and outside the church, what do we hold to as a culture that is an improper view of God? And how do I make sure that that's not creeping in to who I view God as? Because as Tozer said, the most important thing about who I am is how I view God. I thought of a few. I'm sure you could think of a bunch more, but our culture says that God is love. And because he's love, he's going to save everyone. He would never punish anyone, even those who rebel against him. It's not what the Bible teaches. Culturally, I get the sentiment. It says, our culture says God would never judge a relatively good person. And I understand where that comes from. I wish that was true. A lot of days, right? But I'm not God, right? We're all clear on that. I don't make the rules. I don't have as good of a view of humanity as he does. And this is something our culture believes to be true that can start to distort and creep into my view of God, and it changes my behavior. Our culture says that God is basically disproved by science. A lot of our culture says that God prefers one American political party over the other. A lot of our culture, it's not true, right? That's not something God ever put out in his word. Our culture says that morality is not based on God. It's based on what feels right to the individual, as long as those feelings don't lead directly to the harm physically of another person, right? Outside of that, morality, I define my morality by what feels right to me. That can really quickly distort our view of God. Our culture says that God should give me comfort and wealth in this life. I deserve those. Inside and outside the church. We believe that we should experience, I'm not saying you specifically or me specifically, but at times me. I can speak for me. At times I believe my life should be full of ease and comfort. And anything outside of that is like, come on, God, what's this about? And he's like, Joel, when did I ever promise you a life of wealth and comfort? In this life. That's not, it's an improper view of who I am. Samuel had to stand strong to keep his view of God from being distorted by the culture around him, and we have to do the same. There were other voices in Samuel's life that were putting an improper view of who God was out there. For instance, all of Samuel's role models, outside of his mom, who he saw like once a year, but Samuel's role models' view of God. The first group are Eli's sons. How did Eli's sons view God? They saw God, we can pretty safely see from the scriptures. Eli's sons, who were Samuel's essentially older brothers, they saw God as a cultural symbol that they could exploit for personal gain. That's what they were looking for. We get leadership in this community because of God, and it creates an opportunity for us to exploit other people for our personal gain. If we look in 1 Samuel 2:12, it says this, "Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord for their duties as priests. Whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, Eli's sons would send over a servant with a three-pronged fork. While the meat of the sacrificed animal was still boiling, the servant would stick the fork into the pot and demand that whatever it brought up would be given to Eli's sons. All the Israelites who came to worship at Shiloh were treated this way. The man offering the sacrifice might reply, 'Take as much as you want, but the fat must be burned first.' The servant would demand, 'No, give it to me now, or I'll take it by force.'" This may not seem like the most egregious offense to you, but God had prescribed a particular way for people to both bring their sacrifices and to provide sustenance for the priests. They weren't starving, but they didn't like the approach. They didn't like boiled meats all the time. They wanted to roast some of this meat. They wanted to have it their way, not the way God was prescribing. And so then they would threaten people that they couldn't give their sacrifices the way that they wanted to give them to God, the way God had intended, so that they could have the meat however they wanted. So verse 17, "So the sin of these young men was very serious in the Lord's sight, for they treated the Lord's offerings with contempt." We see a little bit more about their behavior in verse 22. "Now Eli was very old, but he was aware of what his sons were doing to the people of Israel. He knew, for instance," this is just a for instance, "that his sons were seducing the young women who assisted at the entrance of the tabernacle." Just a quick for instance. These were Samuel's big brothers and the priests at the tabernacle, where he grew up from the time he was 3 years old. These older brothers are supposed to show him the ropes of what life is supposed to be like as a servant of God, and instead they're just showing him, hey, we can exploit all these people. We can take their stuff, we can seduce the women, we can have whatever we want, and we can do it in the name of God. That is a very distorted view of who God is. They clearly believed in the distant God, right? He's not going to do anything. We can do whatever we want right in his face, and he's going to do nothing. Samuel's role models believed they could do whatever they wanted, and there would be no repercussions. So who do you look up to? Whether it's somebody you know or somebody that you really respect. And you have to ask the question. It's not a fun question. But what is their view of God? You know, I used to listen to all kinds of music that wasn't God glorifying. I was in my garage one day exercising and listening to this band I really liked. They had amazing music, groove, and I was the guy that's like, oh, I just don't listen to the lyrics. And I started, while I'm working out, singing these lyrics out loud that were like directly opposing Jesus Christ by name. I thought, I don't think that this is a good role model for me, right? I think I really have to think twice about who I'm looking up to, who I'm allowing, and what their view of God is. I'm allowing their view to distort mine without knowing. But you could also look at the flip side. We could put a positive spin on it. Who do you look up to? Who do you follow after? Who do you respect? And what have they taught you that's true about God? Right? You aren't Samuel. Samuel only had these examples. Maybe you have. I've had great examples in my life. I've had people, I mean, certainly not perfect, right? We're not looking for perfect, but you know, my father, my mother, my stepmom, my older brother, my youth leaders, my friends, they've lifted my eyes towards God for all of my life. I'm a very spoiled person. And I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful to have had so much of the truth of who God is planted in me. And I still I still move away from that truth, even with all these people that I have to look up to. I'm still, as the song says, I'm prone to wander. Because the reality of who God is, when I see him for who he is, it means he gets everything. And so anything that'll let me out of that, I'm like, oh, maybe over here. But God wants us to know who he is. So we saw his older brothers. Let's look now at Samuel's father figure, Eli. What was his view of God? I would characterize Eli's view of God as this: God is second place to my children. In 1 Samuel 2:29, God is telling Eli through Samuel, this is what I think about your life and behavior. Verse 29 says, so why do you scorn my sacrifices and offerings? And then look at this. Man, this phrase I could think about for a long time. Why do you give your sons more honor than you give me? For you and they have become fat from the best offerings of my people Israel. Can you see the irony in Samuel's life, where his mom prayed and asked God to have a son? God gives her that gift, and she follows through and just openly is like following after God. And he's placed in an environment with a father figure who looks at his sons and says, God, anything but my sons, right? I'll follow you anywhere. I'll do anything. My sons are bad people, but they're misrepresenting your name. They're seducing women, but I'm not going to discipline them. I'm not going to do what it takes because he doesn't tell us why. We could make a bunch of guesses, but for whatever reason, he was putting them in a place over God. So we have to ask ourselves, right? What do we hold dear, more dear than obeying and trusting in God? What might God say about me that, Joel, why do you honor this more than you honor me? It shouldn't happen. It could be any number of things. It could be a relationship. It could be stuff. It could be wealth. Honestly, it could be a sin also in your life that you honor by choosing to just say, God, I'm following you in so many ways. Can you just leave this alone? Like I just have this one thing. Just like, there's so many things I don't do. And God is like, no, don't honor that. Don't think about that. Don't dwell on that. I'm first. I come first in everything. Well, we've looked at the culture's view of God. We looked at Samuel's role models' views of God. Now let's see what Samuel's view was based on the scriptures. Samuel's view of God. I think the first thing that's really clear is that Samuel viewed God in this way. God is near and wants to be known. Those were really important to who Samuel viewed God to be, and by knowing that, he was able to be a risk taker, right? You think about what he was able to do. Samuel was able to just stay and sacrifice and pray while the Philistine army was coming around, and he knew, it seems like a risk to us, but just like his mom, he knew that the risk, what seemed like the riskiest thing, was actually depending on the Creator and doing what he asked, and it wasn't maybe as risky as it might look from the outside. But Samuel knew that God wanted to be known. In Samuel 3:19, it says, as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and everything Samuel said proved to be reliable. And all Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh and gave messages to Samuel there at the tabernacle. Samuel continued to go to hear from God, to connect with God, to talk with him, to listen. They have this really interesting conversation and later on in the story in chapter 8 that I want to read. Just don't worry about the story too much. It's right before Samuel, God decides that he's going to listen to Israel and give Israel a king. But listen to the language that God uses with Samuel, right? You can sense the familiarity, the closeness that they had. In verse 5 of chapter 8, it says, This is the people of Israel. Look, they told him, you are now old. That's not nice. You are now old, and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. Verse 6, Samuel was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. And this is what God said, do everything they say to you. The Lord replied, for they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they've continually abandoned me and followed other gods. And now they're giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. Do you hear the tone where God is like, Samuel, you get me. You understand my heart. I wish they did. I've tried since they were in Egypt. I've tried to get my heart across to them, and for some reason, who I am is just beyond them right now. But this is a picture of someone who God cared about, who leaned in, right? Samuel leaned into his relationship with God. I want to show you a picture of some of our college students here at Mission Hills Church. Just a free plug. College group meets at my house 7 p.m. on Sunday nights. If you know anybody that's like 18 to 25 and wants to have a lot of fun and hang out with cool people, they could also hang out with me and cool people, right, at my house. They can email me, joel@missionhillschurch.com. Or text me at 949-315-1778. Okay, here we go. In the middle is a young man named Andrew. You may remember he was up here about a month ago because he was preparing to leave. He's now in Kosovo serving with the Peace Corps. He's teaching English in Kosovo. And he also, just as an aside, my littlest daughter, who's an age, 6 years old, calls him her baby. Andrew's my baby. So Andrew holds her and she says, oh, my baby Andrew. Anyway, that's just for fun. So Andrew is in Kosovo now. Andrew as he's been there, I didn't know a lot about Kosovo, and so he told me a little bit about it before he left. We've had some communication while he's been there. Kosovo is not a friendly place to Christianity. He feels very isolated as a Christian, extremely isolated. And so it's a really new experience. He grew up as a child of missionaries. He's been around church and church people basically every day of his life until now. And so he's been writing a blog about his experiences over there. And I just want to read you a little bit of what he wrote this past week as it relates to leaning in and being near to God. He wrote this, my entire life, this is just a screenshot from my phone. I got a strong battery there. Okay, all right. My entire life, sorry, I'm distractible. My entire life, I've struggled with practicing my faith at home by myself. I have always placed value on having a place for me to come and be with people who believe the same things I do. This is not to say that such places are bad, because if it did, that would be Mission Hills Church is bad, and it's not, right? But being able to connect with God on a personal level is supremely important for what I believe theologically. Reading the Bible and praying never did it for me because the experiential aspect of my faith never made sense to me. My walk with God has always been an intellectual one, debating about small, indifferent aspects to my religion that don't have an impact on the core of my beliefs. My faith has never been about relationship, and in its most basic form, faith in God is a relationship. I don't know if you can relate to Andrew, but I certainly can. I've been around church my whole life, right? I'm always with church people, and I love you guys. But it can give us I've had seasons of time where being a part of the church gives me a false sense of personal nearness to God. I allow this and small group and having fun with believers to take the place of really being near and connecting with God. Imagine if you did that in any of your other primary relationships. What would my marriage be like if I only talked to my wife on group dates, right? Somebody's like, hey, how's your marriage going? Awesome. Colleen and I have been going on some group dates and talking a lot. It's been really fun. We have a good time, I think my marriage would be horrible. Even though it looks on the outside, and we would genuinely be having fun in a group talking to people, but not talking at home, not debriefing, not talking about life, Not sharing our emotions. I'm learning to do that still, 16 years into marriage. I've heard that's important. Sharing our emotions. But we can so easily do that to God, where we're just like, hey, this isn't a group date, but we're here with a bunch of people in a group, and we all love God, and we're singing genuinely. I'm not saying that you're worshiping God falsely if you're in this place, right? You could genuinely just be praising God when you're in these moments, and then you walk away, and it's like, there's no nearness. Andrew has this. It seems like a difficulty, but I'm sure he already sees it as a benefit of being isolated and saying, oh man, what do I have here? I would compare it to people in a marriage who, when they become empty nesters, right? Their kids go out and then they look at each other and they're like, who are you, right? We've just been raising these kids for these years. Let's try to get to know each other. It can happen in our Christian life. And Andrew goes on to talk about trying to learn to use his time with God differently. I won't go through the whole thing, but he's trying to engage with God and not just have an intellectual reading of Scripture. He's using something, we've talked about it before in a different series, using the Lectio Divina, the divine reading, where you spend time with praying beforehand and relaxing, just talking to God, listening. You spend time with a passage. You kind of put yourself in it, you meditate on it, you think about it, just take time. Then you pray and ask God and listen and be quiet and ask God, how does this relate? What do you have for me today? A lot of us started doing this during the Fruitfulness on the Frontline series. I'd meet with my men's group 6:30 in the morning, and we had a chance to pray together and say, okay, God, today we're going to go out. How do we show your love today, right now? We're going to go to our jobs. We're going to go to our homes. I'm going to try. I'm not great at this at all. I'm going to do this. If you're just looking for a place to start, you're like, I don't even know where to start. I'm going to read Psalm 34 several days this week and just try to spend time with God and say, God, what are you teaching me about you, about me, about life? What do you want from me? How can I have a more proper view of who you are? So if you're looking for a place, we can go together there. Move closer to God. He wants to be near. He wants to be known. He wants to be close to you. And the truth is, it doesn't matter where you've been, right? Maybe you've never had a personal time with God. When you come, He's excited. When you move in His direction, He's ecstatic. He's there waiting. The book of John tells us that God is seeking worshipers who will worship Him in spirit and truth. He's not hiding. He's seeking. He's on the move, right? He's looking for you. And so if you just will say, God, I want to worship you. I want to submit to you in spirit and truth. I want to be found by you. And open yourself up and listen. He wants to do that. So that's the first thing. These other things more briefly. Samuel viewed God as the source of truth. He wasn't looking to culture to define reality. And so he was able to stand strong because he trusted in God above everything else. As God was the source of truth in Samuel's life, he was able to face people that were close to him, right? So the nation of Israel, he was able to say to them, right, we saw before, if you want to return to the Lord with all your hearts, get rid of your foreign gods, get rid of your images of Ashtoreth, turn your hearts towards the Lord and obey Him alone. Then He will rescue you. He knew the truth of who God was. He knew that if these people would turn away from their idols and worship God, that God would meet them there. And so he used that truth about who God was, not to condemn, not to say, hey, guess what? Last 20 years, God's abandoned you because you have false idols, and so God's just going to kill you all. Right? That was not what he did. He knew the truth. He knew the heart of God. He knew that if they chose that day to turn, as they did, he wanted to lift them up, lift them towards God. And what was their response? The response was to get rid of their idols. Their response was to fast. Their response was to confess their sins to God, and they received victory. Samuel knew where the truth came from. Another thing Samuel was able to do with that truth is he was able to face the enemy, as we talked about. Samuel faced the enemy. He was able to stand and pray and sacrifice and trust in God, not in his own strength. He let God send the thunder, right? Whatever Samuel's solution might have been to the problem probably would have been like a little less than sending thunder. And it's the same in our life. Like God is the source of truth. We can depend on him in every circumstance. And finally, Samuel saw God as the source of everything. And this, I really believe, he got from his mother Hannah. Right after the battle is over that we read about in chapter 7, in verses 12 and 13, we see what Samuel does after the battle's over. Samuel then took a large stone and placed it between the towns of Mizpah and Jeshanah. He named the stone Ebenezer, which means the stone of help. Does that remind you of anything? God provides in a miraculous way. And he sets up something, he names something and puts it in a place so he's going to remember. Do you remember his mom last week? Right? She had this child and she thought, I'm never going to forget that God provided me this child. So I'm going to name him Samuel, God hears. And Samuel now is like, I'm never going to forget that God brought the thunder. God set us free. So he names it Ebenezer, which means the stone of help. And he said, up to this point, the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and didn't invade Israel again for some time. And throughout Samuel's lifetime, the Lord's powerful hand was raised against the Philistines. We need to be thankful. God is the source of all that we have. We need to thank him. 1 Thessalonians tells us to be thankful in everything, to give thanks. We need to remember God the way that Samuel did. View him in a way that we see that he's the source. Because when we aren't thankful, then we just appear entitled, right? Like, I deserve this. I deserve this life. I worked hard. I should have all of this. I can tell you just from a parenting perspective, when my kids are entitled and bratty, I want to take away whatever I gave them, and I never want to give them anything again. I'm the only one like that, but that's what I want to do. They complain about their food. I don't do this all the time. I give them food, they complain, I just want to grab it and be like, you don't know. You know. But when they're thankful, I just want to continue to give, right? When they recognize it. And I'm not saying, if you say, this is not a way to manipulate God. I'm not saying, if you say thank you, God will give you a double portion of wealth. I'm not saying that that's true, except he will, just maybe not in this life. God has a future that is full of ease and rest and comfort for you. It's out there. But now, he's not promising that you're going to have everything, but whatever we get in everything, give thanks. He's near. He wants to be known. He expects us to be thankful. He's the source of all truth. He's the source of everything. As the band comes out, we're gonna sing a song called Come Thou Fount. You may have heard it before, but it really speaks to this idea that we are people often that are prone to wander, prone to move away. And we just need to come back to God. And it actually has the line in there, here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come. And I just encourage you, as you sing it, think about, find something that God has overwhelmingly blessed you with, and just say, God, this song is my Ebenezer. I want to remember it's you. You're the provider. You give me everything. I want to say thank you. I want to know you. I want to listen to you. I want to trust you. I want to thank you. I want to worship you. All of these things. So as we sing, I just want to read these words of Samuel one more time. If you want to return to the Lord with all your hearts, get rid of your foreign gods and your images of Ashtoreth. Turn your hearts to the Lord and obey him alone. Why don't you go ahead and stand as we sing?